They thought they'd buried the truth with Ruth Henderson's body. But when Lila opened her mother's last gift, a decaying house in the woods, she unearthed evidence that could bring the whole family empire down. Sign here, and initial at the bottom. Those were the words that changed everything. 3 weeks ago, standing in that musty lawyer's office, Lila had thought she understood what grief felt like. She'd thought losing her mother Ruth was the worst thing that could happen. She'd had no idea that the real devastation was just beginning. 3 weeks later, sitting in what everyone called a ruined house, surrounded by documents that would make her relatives' jaws drop to the floor, Lila finally understood what Ruth had been preparing her for all those years. The house they'd pitted her for inheriting wasn't ruins at all. It was the key to everything. You know what they say about people who underestimate you based on appearances? Sometimes they're so busy laughing at what you got that they miss what you found. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe has a perfect sense of timing when it comes to revealing the truth to people who measure worth in dollar signs and see family as something that can only come through blood. Hey everyone, hope you're having a good day wherever you're watching from. Before we dive deep into this story, make sure to hit that like button if you believe that real wealth isn't always visible. And subscribe because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this whole thing unfolds. This is the story of Lila Morrison. This is how she went from being the grieving adopted daughter who got laughed at during a will reading to the woman who discovered her mother had been building her an empire disguised as ruins. She's talking about land worth millions, investments that generated passive income for years, and a legacy of love that was hidden in plain sight while everyone felt sorry for the black girl who got the scraps. But let's start from the beginning. Lila was 24 when all of this went down. Working as a junior graphic designer, living in the same modest apartment where Ruth had raised her since she was 6 months old. She didn't know her birth parents, didn't even know their names. Ruth Henderson had adopted her as a baby, and for 24 years, that had been all she'd needed to know. Ruth had been a waitress at Morrison's Diner for 38 years. She'd had kind eyes, hands that always smelled of coffee and vanilla, and a way of making Lila feel like she was the most important person in the world. She'd saved her tips in a cookie jar. She'd bought day-old bread because it was half price. She'd told Lila that love wasn't measured by what you could buy, but by what you were willing to build. Lila had believed every word. She'd had no idea how much building Ruth had actually been doing. Ruth had been different from her family. Her sister Miriam and brother Paul came from old money, the kind of white family that had been comfortable for generations. When Ruth adopted Lila, a black baby from foster care, the family had treated it like one of her eccentric phases. Growing up, Lila had felt it in 1,000 small ways. Family gatherings where cousins whispered when she walked into the room. Christmas photos where she was always positioned at the edge. Comments about her hair being so different and interesting to manage. Aunt Miriam introducing her as Ruth's project at social events. Uncle Paul making jokes about urban culture whenever she had opinions that differed from theirs. They'd made her feel grateful for their tolerance while reminding her that tolerance wasn't the same as belonging. She was Ruth's charity case, the good deed that earned Ruth points, but she would never really be family to them. But Ruth had been different. She'd pull Lila aside after brutal family gatherings and remind her that she was chosen for a reason. Lila, she'd say, sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Don't let anyone convince you that you're not exactly where you're supposed to be. They'd had their ritual. Sunday morning pancakes that were always slightly burned on one side, sitting at their tiny kitchen table talking about everything. Ruth would ask about Lila's design projects, her dreams of maybe starting her own freelance business. She'd never talked much about herself, though, about her past or why she'd walked away from her family's wealth to work at a diner. When Lila asked, Ruth would smile and say, "My real story started the day they placed you in my arms, sweetheart." Lila had thought it was beautiful. She hadn't known Ruth was hiding something massive. The phone call came on a Thursday morning. Heart attack. Sudden. Critical. Ruth died 18 minutes before Lila got there. The funeral was small. A few diner regulars. Mrs. Thompson from downstairs. Tom, Ruth's manager, who cried harder than Lila did. And then there were the relatives. Aunt Miriam arrived in a designer dress. Uncle Paul kept checking his Rolex. Their children looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. They'd never visited Ruth while she was alive, never called on holidays. They came for the will reading. Attorney David Walsh's office smelled like old leather and furniture polish. The space felt too formal for Ruth, too expensive for a woman who'd spent nearly 4 decades serving coffee. Walsh arranged chairs in a semicircle with Lila in the middle and the relatives flanking her like spectators. Ruth Henderson's estate is quite straightforward, Walsh began. She had minimal liquid assets. $800 in savings. The apartment was a rental. No vehicle, no stocks, no bonds. The disappointment in the room was almost visible. Aunt Miriam's shoulders sagged. Uncle Paul stopped paying attention. Cousin Jennifer and Brad pulled out their phones. However, Walsh continued, and something in his tone made Lila focus, Ruth did own one piece of property. A house located at 1847 Meadowbrook Lane in Ashford County. The deed is paid in full, and ownership transfers entirely to Lila Morrison. Silence. Then Aunt Miriam started laughing. Not a polite chuckle. A full laugh like she'd just heard the funniest joke of her life. That old place. Miriam managed between laughs. Oh honey, I'm so sorry. It's been falling apart for years. Hasn't been lived in for decades. You've seen it? Lila asked. Once, maybe 25 years ago. It's in the middle of nowhere, Lila. The roof probably caved in by now. It's the kind of place that costs more to demolish than it's worth. Uncle Paul leaned forward with false sympathy. You could sell the land, at least. Might get a few thousand if you're lucky. Brad muttered something under his breath that sounded like charity till the end, and Jennifer snorted. Walsh cleared his throat. There is one additional stipulation. Ruth specified that Lila must personally visit the property and explore it thoroughly before making any decisions about sale or disposition. Why? The question came out smaller than Lila intended. Walsh's eyes softened. She didn't explain her reasoning, Miss Morrison. But Ruth was very particular about that clause. She said you would understand when you got there. Aunt Miriam stood up, already dismissing her. Well, good luck with that, sweetie. At least Ruth tried to leave you something, even if it's not much. That's more than some people get. The way she said some people made it clear she meant people like Lila. Black girls from foster care who should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. The relatives filed out quickly, their disappointment obvious but also their relief. No fortune to argue over. Just a broken-down house for the adopted daughter who'd never really belonged anyway. Walsh waited until they left. Miss Morrison, your mother visited me 6 months ago. She knew she didn't have much time. He pulled an envelope from his folder. She asked me to give you this. Inside were 3 things, keys, an old photograph, and a note on diner receipt paper. Sweetheart, the note read. I know you're confused right now, but trust me one more time. Go to the house. Look at everything, even the parts that seem worthless. Some fortunes are buried, baby girl. Some have to be discovered. The house holds everything I couldn't tell you while I was alive. Mom. The photograph showed Ruth as a young woman standing in front of a small house, looking serious and determined, like she was carrying secrets that weighed more than she did. 3 days after the funeral, Lila drove to Meadowbrook Lane. The address led her 40 minutes outside the city, down progressively smaller roads, until she was on a dirt lane barely wide enough for her car. The house appeared suddenly through the trees, and her heart sank. Aunt Miriam hadn't been exaggerating. Paint peeling in long strips. Shutters hanging at wrong angles. A front porch sagging in the middle. Broken windows. Weeds growing so high you could barely see the foundation. This was Ruth's final gift. This was what she got for 24 years of love. Lila sat in her car for a long time, staring at the structure and feeling something close to betrayal. Ruth had worked herself to death at that diner. She'd walked away from her wealthy family to raise Lila in a tiny apartment. And this is what she'd been holding on to. This wreck? Part of her wondered if Aunt Miriam was right. Maybe Ruth had left her this because it was all she could afford. Maybe the charity extended to adoption, but not to actual wealth. Maybe Lila really was just the project. But Ruth's note was in her pocket. Trust me one more time. She'd trusted Ruth her whole life. She could trust her one more time. The front door key turned smoothly, which surprised her. If the house had been empty for decades, she'd expected rust. Instead, the door opened easily, almost like someone had been maintaining it. The interior was confusing. Everything was covered in white sheets, but underneath were beautiful pieces. Solid wood furniture. Quality pieces that didn't match the exterior ruins. The floors were scuffed but solid. The windows were filthy but intact. The kitchen was outdated but functional. Someone had been keeping this house livable while letting it look abandoned from the outside. Why? In the master bedroom, she found something that stopped her cold. A framed photograph on the nightstand showed Ruth and teenage Lila wearing hard hats, standing in front of a construction site, both smiling and covered in dust. She'd never seen that photograph before. Didn't recognize the site. Someone had been here recently. Someone wanted her to see it. Her phone rang. Aunt Miriam. Lila, hi sweetie. Just checking in. How's the house? Fine. Just looking around. Well, that's why I'm calling. Miriam's voice had that false sweetness. Paul and I realize this is probably overwhelming for you. Property ownership, taxes, all that complicated stuff you're probably not familiar with. So we have an idea. Lila waited, knowing where this was going. We know a developer looking for properties in that area. We could connect you, handle the paperwork, negotiate. You'd walk away with cash and no headaches. How much? Miriam laughed. Given the condition, probably 40 or 50,000. Honestly generous for a place that needs so much work. 50,000 for property Ruth owned free and clear. Property she'd maintained secretly. Property she'd told Lila to explore thoroughly. Thanks, but I'll hold on to it for now. Silence stretched long. When Miriam spoke again, the sweetness was gone. Lila, I'm trying to help you. You don't know anything about property management. You've never owned anything in your life. You're going to lose money on repairs and taxes. Maybe. But it's my risk. This isn't about risk. This is about being realistic about your capabilities. Miriam paused. Your mother left you that house because she felt sorry for you, not because she thought you could handle being a property owner. Ruth loved you, but she knew your limitations. There it was. The house wasn't real inheritance. It was charity. Lila should be grateful for scraps. Thanks for the advice. She hung up, hands shaking. Maybe Miriam was right. Maybe she was naive. Maybe Ruth had left her this wreck because it was safe, because even if Lila failed, no real money would be lost. But looking at the photograph of Ruth and teenage Lila in hard hats, something clicked. Ruth never did anything without a reason. If she'd left this property with instructions to explore thoroughly, there had to be more. Lila decided to check the basement. The stairs were solid wood, recently reinforced based on the new nails. Why reinforce stairs in an abandoned house? The basement was large, mostly empty except for one corner, where something was covered by a canvas tarp. She pulled the tarp away and found 4 tall metal filing cabinets lined up like sentries guarding secrets. The first cabinet was locked, but Ruth's keys worked. The drawer slid open. Inside were property deeds. Dozens of them in clear plastic sleeves with rental statements attached. She pulled one at random. A duplex generating $2,800 monthly. Purchased 12 years ago for $65,000, now worth over $200,000. She checked the owner name, expecting Ruth's name. Instead, she saw her own. Lila Morrison, sole owner. Her vision blurred as she grabbed another deed. An office building generating $4,000 monthly. Her name. A fourplex. Her name. A retail plaza. Her name. Every single property was titled to her. Every single one generated income. Every single one represented investments Ruth had made quietly while everyone thought she had nothing. Lila sank to the concrete floor, surrounded by deeds representing wealth she hadn't known existed. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was Ruth building her an empire, while everyone assumed she was just a waitress who'd adopted a charity case. The second cabinet contained financial statements. Bank accounts in Lila's name with rental deposits. The most recent showed balances totaling over $300,000. $300,000. Just sitting there. Waiting. The third cabinet held business papers. Ruth had created Morrison Holdings LLC with Lila as sole owner. She'd been managing these properties for years, building Lila a business she didn't even know she had. The fourth cabinet was locked. The last key on Ruth's ring finally worked. Inside was a thick envelope with Lila's name, and a small leather journal. She opened the envelope. A letter several pages long, in Ruth's careful handwriting. "My dearest Lila," it began. "If you're reading this, you found what I've been building for you. The properties, the accounts, the business. The empire I created while everyone thought I was just serving coffee and raising a charity case. But before you understand what this means, you need to know the truth about your adoption, about my family, and about why I spent 24 years building this fortune in secret. I need to tell you about your birth mother. And I need to tell you what my family did to her." Lila stopped reading, her heart pounding. Her birth mother. Ruth had never told her anything, always said the records were sealed. But now, surrounded by evidence of wealth and secrets, she was about to learn the truth. And somehow, she knew that truth was going to change everything. Lila's hands trembled as she held Ruth's letter. The basement suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. She forced herself to keep reading, even though part of her wanted to stop, wanted to preserve the simple story she'd always believed about her life. "Your birth mother's name was Diana Morrison," Ruth's letter continued. "She was 22 years old, studying to be a teacher, working part-time at a bookstore to support herself while raising you alone. She loved you more than anything in this world, Lila. She didn't abandon you. She fought for you until the very end." The words blurred. Diana Morrison. Lila had a name now. A real name attached to the phantom mother she'd spent her whole life wondering about. Diana was in a car accident when you were 4 months old. She spent 8 months in a coma, then another 6 months in rehabilitation learning to walk and talk again. During that time, you were placed in temporary foster care. The plan was always to return you to her once she recovered. But my family made sure that never happened. Lila's stomach turned. She kept reading, even as tears started falling onto the paper. "I saw your picture in a case file at the adoption agency. My sister Miriam was on the board, and she'd brought home files to review. I saw your face, and something in me just knew. I wanted you so desperately that I convinced myself I deserved you more than anyone else could. So I used my family's money and connections to make sure Diana Morrison could never get you back." The confession hit Lila like a physical blow. Ruth had stolen her. Not saved her, not rescued her from poverty or neglect. Stolen her from a mother who was fighting to recover, who was trying to get her baby back. We paid social workers to write reports saying Diana was unfit. We bribed doctors to exaggerate her disabilities from the accident. We hired lawyers to convince a judge that Diana would never be capable of raising a child properly. And when Diana tried to fight back, when she begged for more time to prove she could care for you, we made sure those pleas never reached anyone who could help her. Lila couldn't breathe. The basement walls seemed to be closing in. Everything she'd believed about her adoption, about being chosen and wanted, was built on lies and theft and corruption. The adoption was finalized when you were 18 months old. Diana Morrison spent the next 23 years trying to find you. She sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts every single year to our address. I kept them all. I kept them because I was too much of a coward to give them to you, but too guilty to throw them away. Ruth had kept them. Somewhere in this house were 23 years of love letters from a mother Lila had never known. A mother who'd never stopped looking for her stolen daughter. Diana Morrison died 6 months ago, Lila. She died of a heart attack while working at Riverside Elementary School, where she'd taught for 18 years. She died still loving you, still hoping that someday you'd know the truth. 6 months ago. Diana had been alive just 6 months ago, less than an hour away at Riverside Elementary. All those years Lila had wondered about her birth mother, had imagined her as someone who couldn't handle being a parent, who'd given her up willingly. Diana had been right there, teaching children the same age Lila had been when she was stolen. I know this is devastating to learn. I know you probably hate me right now, and you have every right to. What I did was unforgivable. I stole you from someone who loved you unconditionally, and I can never make that right. But I can give you something Diana would have given you if she'd been allowed to raise you. I can give you the financial security and independence to never depend on anyone else's approval. I can give you the resources to build whatever life you choose. That's what the properties represent, Lila. That's what Morrison Holdings is. I named it after your birth mother because everything I built for you should honor the woman I stole you from. Lila set the letter down, unable to read anymore. She sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by evidence of wealth built on guilt, and let herself break apart. Ruth had stolen her. The woman she'd loved more than anyone, the woman who'd made her feel chosen and special, had ripped her away from a mother who'd fought desperately to keep her. And then Ruth had spent 24 years building her fortune as some kind of penance, as if money could ever compensate for a stolen childhood. But there was more in the envelope. Lila wiped her eyes and pulled out additional papers. Legal documents, adoption records, and at the bottom, a small key with a tag that read First National Bank, Box 247. The adoption records told the story Ruth had confessed to. Social worker reports full of lies about Diana's capability. Medical assessments that exaggerated her recovery time. Court documents showing Diana's desperate attempts to regain custody, all of them denied based on false information Ruth's family had provided. There were also documents Lila didn't expect. Receipts showing payments made to social workers. Canceled checks to lawyers and court officials. A paper trail proving that Ruth's family had bought Lila through systematic bribery and corruption. And at the very bottom of the stack, a newspaper clipping from 6 months ago. Diana Morrison, beloved elementary school teacher, dead at 46. The obituary mentioned her dedication to education, her love for her students, and the daughter she'd lost to adoption years earlier. She'd never stopped claiming Lila as her daughter. Even after losing every legal battle, even after 23 years of separation, Diana had told people she had a daughter. She'd never let go. Lila's phone buzzed with a text message. Aunt Miriam again. Lila, we really think you should reconsider our offer on the property. The longer you wait, the more expensive the maintenance becomes. Let us help you before this becomes a real financial burden. The audacity was stunning. Miriam was still trying to take from her, still assuming Lila was too naive to understand what she had. And based on Ruth's letter, Miriam had been part of stealing her in the first place. The sister on the adoption agency board who'd brought home files for Ruth to review. Lila stood up, legs shaky but determination building. She grabbed the small leather journal she'd found in the cabinet and opened it. Inside were entries in Ruth's handwriting, dated over the past 2 years. A detailed record of every property purchase, every investment decision, every financial move she'd made to build Lila's empire. But the entries weren't just financial records. They were confessions, explanations, preparations for this exact moment. March 15th, 2 years ago, Lila identified an undervalued property in Riverside, near the school where Diana teaches. She doesn't know Diana works there. She doesn't know her birth mother is less than a mile away. I bought the property using her analysis, put it in her name, and started building her portfolio in the town where Diana lives. Maybe it's my way of trying to bring them close to each other, even if Lila doesn't know it yet. Ruth had been using Lila's investment research for years, quietly building her portfolio based on properties Lila identified, markets she analyzed, opportunities she spotted. Every business trip they'd taken together, every property visit where Ruth asked Lila's opinion, had been Ruth gathering intelligence to invest in Lila's name. June 3rd, 18 months ago, Lila suggested we look at properties in college towns. She said rental demand near universities is stable even during economic downturns. I bought 3 properties near state schools, all in her name. She was right, of course. The girl has a natural understanding of investment that none of my family ever developed. They inherited wealth. She's building it without even knowing. Page after page of entries showing Ruth using Lila's intelligence to create wealth in secret. Training her, teaching her, preparing her to take over a business she didn't know she owned. November 12th, 1 year ago, Diana Morrison contacted a lawyer about challenging Lila's adoption. She found evidence that the medical reports were falsified. I'm terrified. Not because I'll be exposed, but because Lila deserves to know the truth, and I'm still too selfish to tell her. I'm accelerating the property acquisitions. If Diana succeeds in exposing what we did, at least Lila will have financial security that no one can take away. Diana had been trying to reach her. Right up until the end, she'd been fighting to expose the truth. And Ruth had known, had been racing to build Lila's fortune before everything came crashing down. The final entry was dated 1 week before Ruth's death. My heart is failing faster than the doctors predicted. I don't have time to tell Lila everything face to face. I don't have the courage anyway. So I'm leaving her the cottage, the key to everything I built for her. I'm leaving her the truth about her adoption, about Diana, about my family's corruption. And I'm leaving her a choice. She can sell everything, take the money, and walk away from the family that stole her. Or she can use what I built to claim her rightful place and make them answer for what they did. I pray she chooses to fight, because the Lila I raised is stronger than any of them, smarter than any of them, and more deserving of the Henderson fortune than the people who were born into it. My family thinks they won when Diana died 6 months ago. They think the secret is safe now. They don't know I've been documenting everything. They don't know I've built Lila an empire that makes their inheritance look like pocket change. And they certainly don't know that Lila has been the real business mind behind my success for the past 10 years. I'm so sorry for what I did to Diana. I'm sorry for stealing you, Lila. But I'm not sorry for loving you. And I'm not sorry for making sure you have the power to seek justice when you're ready. Lila closed the journal, her emotions a tangled mess of grief, anger, betrayal, and something she didn't expect, determination. Ruth had stolen her from Diana. That was unforgivable. But Ruth had also built her the tools to fight back against the family that had facilitated that theft. The same family that was still trying to steal from her, still treating her like a charity case who should be grateful for scraps. She thought about Aunt Miriam's calls, the pressure to sell the property for $50,000 when it was clearly worth more. She thought about 24 years of subtle racism and exclusion, of being made to feel like she didn't belong, like she should be grateful for tolerance. She thought about Diana Morrison, teaching school less than an hour away, sending birthday cards that were never delivered, dying without ever getting to hold her daughter again. The key to First National Bank was still in Lila's hand. According to Ruth's letter, that safety deposit box contained the birthday cards and Christmas gifts Diana had sent. 23 years of love that had been intercepted and hidden. Lila needed to see them. She needed to know what Diana had wanted to say to her all those years. But first, she needed to secure what Ruth had built. Because if Aunt Miriam and Uncle Paul were already pressuring her to sell the cottage, they'd escalate once they realized what else existed. They'd find a way to claim the properties were part of Ruth's estate, that Lila had obtained them fraudulently, that a 24-year-old black woman couldn't possibly own a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio legitimately. She pulled out her phone and searched for property management companies in the area. The business papers in the filing cabinet listed Morrison Holdings LLC with a local address. Ruth had been managing the properties through a company, which meant someone had been handling the day-to-day operations. The number for Morrison Holdings connected on the second ring. Morrison Holdings, this is Patricia speaking. Patricia, this is Lila Morrison. I think we need to meet. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been relief. Miss Morrison, I've been waiting for your call. Mrs. Henderson told me you'd be taking over management of the portfolio when you were ready. When would you like to schedule a meeting? As soon as possible. Tomorrow morning? Absolutely. Should I prepare the full financial reports and property status updates? Everything. I want to see everything. After hanging up, Lila stood in the basement surrounded by filing cabinets full of secrets and felt something shift inside her. For 24 years, she'd been trying to earn love from people who viewed her as charity. She'd been accepting their definition of her worth, their assessment of her capabilities, their judgment about her place in their family. But Ruth's letter had revealed something Miriam and Paul didn't know. The properties Lila owned weren't just valuable. They were more valuable than anything the Henderson family had left after Ruth walked away from her inheritance to raise Lila. Ruth had distanced herself from family wealth specifically so she could build something separate, something that would belong entirely to Lila without the family being able to claim it. Which meant Lila wasn't the poor relation dependent on family charity. She was potentially wealthier than all of them combined. And they had no idea. Her phone rang again. Uncle Paul this time. Lila, Miriam mentioned you're being stubborn about the property situation. I'm calling as the executor of Ruth's estate to clarify something important. Lila's stomach tightened. I thought Mr. Walsh was handling the estate. Walsh handled the will reading, but I'm the executor for any property-related issues. And I need to inform you that there may be some complications with the cottage deed. Ruth's mental state was declining in her final months, and there are questions about whether she was competent to make property decisions. The threat was clear. They were going to challenge Ruth's competency to try to invalidate the cottage inheritance. And if they succeeded with the cottage, they'd try to claim anything else Lila owned had been obtained through fraud or manipulation of a dying woman. Ruth seemed perfectly competent when she met with Mr. Walsh 6 months ago, Lila said carefully. 6 months ago, yes. But the cottage deed has some irregularities that suggest it might have been transferred more recently, possibly when Ruth was already quite ill. We just want to make sure everything is legal and proper, for your protection as much as anyone's. Lies. Paul was already building a case to take the cottage, probably so they could search it and find the filing cabinets, the business documents, everything Ruth had hidden there. I appreciate your concern, Uncle Paul, but I'm comfortable with the inheritance as it stands. Lila, you need to understand that if there are legal challenges to the cottage ownership, you could end up with nothing. Wouldn't it be smarter to accept our offer now, take the $50,000, and avoid a lengthy legal battle you can't afford to fight? There it was. The real pressure. Accept their lowball offer or face legal bills that would drain whatever small savings she had. They were betting she'd choose the easy money over a fight she couldn't win. They didn't know she'd just discovered she had the resources to fight back. They didn't know Morrison Holdings existed. They didn't know she owned properties worth millions. I'll think about it, Lila said, and hung up before Paul could push further. She looked around the basement one more time, memorizing the location of everything. Tomorrow she'd meet with Patricia and understand the full scope of what she owned. Tomorrow she'd visit First National Bank and read the letters from Diana that had been kept from her. Tomorrow she'd start making decisions about what to do with the truth Ruth had left her. But tonight, sitting in the basement of a house everyone thought was worthless, Lila understood something Ruth had been trying to teach her all along. Real wealth wasn't about the money. It was about understanding how money worked, how power shifted, how people revealed their character when they thought you had nothing. Ruth had given her 24 years of lessons in how to survive people who underestimated her. Now she'd given her the resources to make sure they'd never underestimate her again. The question was whether Lila was ready to stop being the grateful adopted daughter and become the woman who fought back. Looking at Ruth's journal, at Diana's obituary, at 24 years of stolen birthday cards and subtle cruelty, Lila realized the answer. She was done being small. She was done being grateful for tolerance. She was done accepting other people's definition of her worth. Ruth had stolen her from Diana. That was unforgivable. But Ruth had also armed her with everything she'd need to seek justice for that theft. And justice was about to come for the Henderson family, whether they were ready for it or not. The meeting with Patricia changed everything Lila thought she understood about her life. Morrison Holdings had an office in a professional building downtown, the kind of place Lila had walked past hundreds of times without knowing it existed. She arrived at 9 the next morning, Ruth's journal and the cottage keys clutched in her bag like talismans. Patricia Turner was a black woman in her 50s with silver-streaked natural hair and the kind of calm competence that came from managing complex situations for decades. She stood to shake Lila's hand as soon as she entered the office. Miss Morrison, it's so good to finally meet you properly. Mrs. Henderson spoke about you constantly. She was so proud of your analytical abilities. Lila looked around the office. Professional, organized, with charts on the walls showing property locations and financial projections. This wasn't some side operation Ruth had been running casually. This was a legitimate business. How long have you been managing the properties? Lila asked. 8 years. Mrs. Henderson hired me after the portfolio grew beyond what she could manage alone. She was very specific about her vision for the company and about preparing everything for the day you'd take over. Patricia gestured to a conference table covered with files, financial statements, and property photographs. I've prepared everything you'll need to understand your holdings. I should warn you, it's quite extensive. Extensive was an understatement. Over the next 3 hours, Patricia walked Lila through a real estate empire she hadn't known she owned. 27 properties across 5 states, generating over $48,000 per month in rental income. A property management company with 6 employees who'd been maintaining the buildings for years. investment accounts containing over $2.8 million in accumulated profits. Mrs. Henderson was very specific about how she wanted this portfolio managed, Patricia explained, showing Lila monthly financial reports going back 8 years. She said you'd provided the market analysis and investment strategy for most of these acquisitions, even though you didn't realize it at the time. Lila stared at a map showing all her properties marked with colored pins. College towns, growing suburbs, gentrifying neighborhoods. Every single location was somewhere she and Ruth had visited during their business trips. Places where teenage Lila had made observations about property values or neighborhood potential. She really bought properties based on my teenage observations? Patricia smiled. Your observations combined with her capital and experience have generated a 12% average annual return over the past decade. That's better than most professional investment firms achieve. The numbers were staggering. Lila owned more than she'd made in 5 years of working as a designer. She owned more than most people accumulated in a lifetime. Ruth had taken every insight Lila had casually mentioned and turned it into wealth. But then Patricia said something that made Lila's stomach drop. Of course, we've been transferring funds to support some of Mrs. Henderson's family obligations for the past 2 years. She was very concerned about maintaining family relationships while she was ill. What kind of transfers? Patricia pulled out another set of files, and Lila's hands started shaking as she read through them. Over the past 2 years, her real estate profits had been quietly subsidizing the Henderson family businesses. $50,000 here for Aunt Miriam's antique shop that was failing. $75,000 there for Uncle Paul's investment venture that had gone bad. $20,000 to Cousin Brad for his restaurant that couldn't make rent. Did they know the money was coming from my accounts? Lila's voice came out harder than she intended. Mrs. Henderson structured the transfers to appear as if they were coming from her personal holdings. She wanted to avoid family complications while she determined the best long-term strategy. Family complications. Ruth had been protecting them from the humiliation of knowing the black adopted daughter they treated as charity was the one keeping their businesses afloat. How much total have we transferred? Patricia consulted her records. Approximately $340,000 over the past 2 years. $340,000 of Lila's money had been propping up people who made jokes about urban culture and treated her like a project. People who were now pressuring her to sell the cottage for $50,000 because they assumed she was too incompetent to handle property ownership. Patricia, I need you to stop all transfers to the Henderson family immediately. I've been waiting for that instruction since Mrs. Henderson's passing. Consider it done. Lila spent the rest of the meeting reviewing property details, tenant information, and financial projections. By the time she left Morrison Holdings, her head was spinning with numbers and possibilities. But underneath the confusion was a growing sense of power. She wasn't the poor relation. She wasn't the charity case. She was potentially wealthier than the entire Henderson family combined, and they had no idea. The realization should have felt good. Instead, it felt dangerous. Her phone started ringing before she even reached her car. Uncle Paul. Then Aunt Miriam. Then Cousin Jennifer. All within 10 minutes of each other. She let them go to voicemail, but the frequency told her something had changed. They'd discovered the money had stopped flowing. The voicemails confirmed her suspicion. Paul's message was barely controlled panic. Lila, we need to talk immediately. There's been some kind of banking error with family accounts. Call me back as soon as you get this. Miriam was more direct. Lila, I don't know what's going on, but there are serious problems with our business accounts. We need to sort this out today. Jennifer's message revealed more than she probably intended. Lila, this isn't funny. Whatever you think you're doing by blocking family financial arrangements, you're going to cause serious problems. Call us back immediately. They thought she'd somehow caused the transfer halt. They didn't understand that the money had been hers all along, that stopping the subsidies was just Lila taking control of her own assets. But their panic meant they'd been dependent on that money. Whatever businesses they were running weren't actually profitable without her support. She was still listening to voicemails when a car pulled into the parking lot and stopped directly behind hers, blocking her in. Uncle Paul's luxury sedan, followed by Aunt Miriam's SUV. They'd tracked her down. Somehow they'd figured out where she was. Paul got out of his car looking agitated, his usual composed demeanor cracking. Miriam followed, her face tight with poorly concealed anger. "Lila, we need to talk. Now." Paul didn't wait for permission, just started walking toward Morrison Holdings' entrance like he owned the place. "How did you know I was here?" Lila asked, staying by her car. "We have ways of tracking family whereabouts when there are estate complications," Miriam said, which probably meant they'd put some kind of tracker on her car or phone. "The important thing is that we need to discuss these banking irregularities before they cause serious damage to family businesses." "What banking irregularities?" Paul's jaw clenched. Money that was supposed to be automatically transferred to various family accounts has stopped flowing. Ruth set up these arrangements before she died to ensure smooth business operations, and somehow the transfers have been blocked. They were lying. Ruth hadn't set up anything except secret subsidies they'd been taking advantage of for years. "I'm not sure what that has to do with me," Lila said carefully. Miriam stepped closer, her voice dropping to that dangerous sweetness she used when she was about to be particularly cruel. "Lila, honey, we know you're upset about the cottage situation. We know you feel like you didn't get what you deserved from Ruth's will. But interfering with legitimate family business arrangements isn't going to change your inheritance." The gaslighting was immediate and familiar. They were reframing her discovery of their theft as her being upset about not getting enough. They were making her the problem for questioning arrangements she'd never agreed to. "I haven't interfered with anything," Lila said, though that was technically a lie. She'd absolutely interfered by stopping the transfers. But they didn't need to know she'd done it deliberately. "Then why have the transfers stopped?" Paul demanded. "These are automated systems that Ruth set up personally. The only way they'd stop is if someone with access to the accounts changed the authorization." He was fishing, trying to figure out if Lila had discovered the truth, trying to determine how much she knew. "Maybe you should talk to Ruth's bank about technical issues," Lila suggested. "I'm just dealing with the cottage inheritance. I don't know anything about business accounts." Miriam and Paul exchanged looks that confirmed Lila's suspicion. They'd been counting on her remaining ignorant, staying in her place as the grateful adopted daughter who didn't ask questions. "Lila," Miriam said, her voice hardening, "we're trying to be patient with you, but this situation is time-sensitive. We have employees who need to be paid. We have vendors waiting for payments. Every day these transfers are blocked costs real money and damages business relationships we've spent years building." "Then maybe your businesses need better financial planning," Lila said, surprising herself with the directness. Paul's face went red. "Excuse me? If your businesses can't handle a temporary interruption in funding, maybe the problem isn't the banking system. Maybe the problem is that your operations aren't actually profitable." The silence that followed was heavy with shock and anger. Lila had never challenged them like this before. She'd always been careful, always been grateful, always accepted their authority without question. Miriam recovered first. "Lila, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this attitude isn't helping anyone. Ruth would be devastated to see you acting like this toward family." The invocation of Ruth's disappointment was calculated to make Lila feel guilty. It had worked for 24 years. "Not anymore. I think Ruth would understand exactly what I'm doing," Lila said quietly. Paul stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threat he wasn't quite ready to make explicit. "Lila, you need to be very careful about the decisions you're making right now. Family relationships are more important than money, but money can definitely destroy family relationships if it's not handled responsibly." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reminder that you're part of this family whether you like it or not. And families take care of each other, especially when some members have more resources than others." There it was. The implicit demand that Lila share whatever she had with them, that she continue accepting their authority and supporting their lifestyle, or face exclusion from the only family she'd ever known. But Lila had spent the morning discovering she didn't need their family. She had resources they couldn't imagine. She had a business they didn't know about. And she had documentation of every dollar they'd taken from her over the past 2 years. "I appreciate your concern," Lila said, unlocking her car door. "But I need to go. I have appointments." "What appointments?" Miriam demanded. "What were you doing in that building?" "Personal business." "Personal business in a property management office?" Paul's eyes narrowed. "Lila, what's going on?" What aren't you telling us? They were panicking, realizing she knew something they didn't. Realizing their control was slipping. Nothing that concerns you, Lila said, getting into her car. If you're worried about your business finances, I suggest you talk to your accountants. She pulled out of the parking spot, forcing them to move their cars, and drove away before they could follow. But in her rearview mirror, she saw them standing in the parking lot having an animated conversation, and she knew this wasn't over. They'd escalate. They'd get more aggressive. They'd try to find out what she knew and what she owned. And when they discovered the truth about Morrison Holdings, they'd do everything possible to take it away from her. Lila's next stop was First National Bank. The safety deposit box Diana had left required 2 keys, the one Ruth had given her and a bank master key. The bank manager led her to a private viewing room and left her alone with a metal box that contained 23 years of stolen love. The birthday cards were on top. Handmade cards for the early years when Diana had been struggling financially, store-bought ones later when she'd become more stable. Each one signed, "Love always, your mother Diana," with messages about hoping Lila was happy, hoping she was loved, hoping someday they'd meet again. The Christmas presents were wrapped but never opened. Small things, books, art supplies, a necklace with a small L charm. Gifts chosen by someone who knew her daughter's name, but nothing else about her. And at the bottom of the box, a thick envelope addressed to Lila in Diana's handwriting. "My darling girl," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me before I could find the courage to contact you directly, or before the legal system finally gave me justice. I've spent 23 years gathering evidence about your adoption, preparing for the day when I might be able to prove that you were stolen from me through fraud and corruption." Diana's letter detailed everything Ruth had confessed to. The falsified medical reports, the bribed social workers, the court officials who'd been paid to deny Diana's custody appeals. But Diana had also documented something Ruth's letter hadn't mentioned. Evidence that the Henderson family had known all along that Diana was fighting to get Lila back, and they'd systematically destroyed every attempt she'd made. "Lila, I want you to know that I never stopped believing you were stolen from me, and I never stopped fighting to prove it. The evidence in this box would have been enough to challenge your adoption and expose the corruption that separated us. But more importantly, I want you to know that losing you was the greatest tragedy of my life, and not a day has passed that I haven't thought about you, loved you, and wished I could hold you again." There were more documents in the box. Copies of Diana's custody petitions, records of her rehabilitation and her teaching career. Proof that she'd built a stable, loving life where Lila would have thrived if she'd been allowed to come home. And at the very bottom, a photograph. Diana holding baby Lila in the hospital, looking at her newborn daughter with pure love and wonder. On the back, Diana had written, "The day you were born, the happiest day of my life, before they took you away from me." Lila sat in that bank viewing room holding the photograph and understanding finally what had been stolen from both of them. Not just the years they could have had together, but the simple right to love each other without interference from people who thought money gave them the authority to destroy families. Ruth had built her an empire out of guilt, but Diana had left her something more valuable. Evidence that she'd been loved unconditionally by someone who'd fought until her last breath to get her back. When Lila left the bank, she knew what she had to do. The Henderson family was already escalating their pressure. They'd find out about Morrison Holdings eventually, and when they did, they'd claim she'd obtained it fraudulently. They'd use the legal system the same way they'd used it to steal her from Diana. She needed to move first. She needed to secure everything Ruth had built before they could take it away. And she needed to make sure they'd never underestimate her again. She called Patricia from her car. "Patricia, I need you to do something for me. I need you to copy every document related to my portfolio and secure them in multiple locations. And I need you to prepare a complete accounting of every transfer we made to Henderson family members over the past 2 years. Are you expecting legal challenges? I'm expecting war." The legal papers arrived 3 days after Lila's confrontation with Paul and Miriam in the parking lot. A courier delivered them directly to her apartment at 7 in the morning, official and intimidating in their manila envelope. "Petition to contest testamentary capacity," read the header. Paul Henderson was challenging Ruth's mental competency at the time she'd written her will, claiming she'd been unduly influenced by Lila during her final illness. The petition sought to invalidate the cottage inheritance and return all of Ruth's property to the legitimate estate, meaning the Henderson family. Lila sat on her couch reading through pages of legal language that basically accused her of manipulating a dying woman. They'd included medical records showing Ruth's heart disease, testimony from nurses about her declining condition, and sworn statements from Miriam and Paul claiming Ruth had been confused and disoriented in her final months. All lies. Ruth had been sharp until the very end, but proving that would require a legal battle Lila supposedly couldn't afford. Her phone rang. David Walsh, the attorney who'd handled the will reading. "Miss Morrison, I just received a copy of the contestation petition. I wanted to reach out immediately to discuss your options." "Do I have any?" Lila asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "The challenge is weak. Ruth was clearly competent when we met 6 months before her death. I have detailed notes from our meetings showing her decision-making was sound. But defending against it will still require legal fees, potentially tens of thousands of dollars if they push this to trial." Which was exactly what Paul and Miriam were counting on. Bury Lila in legal bills she couldn't pay, force her to settle by accepting their original $50,000 offer just to make the lawsuit go away. They didn't know she had the resources to fight back. They were still operating under the assumption that she was the broke adopted daughter grateful for whatever scraps came her way. "Mr. Walsh, I want to fight this. What do I need to do?" There was a pause on the line. "Miss Morrison, I want to be direct with you. This kind of litigation can drag on for months. Even though I believe we'd win, the process itself could be financially devastating for someone in your position. What if I told you my position is different than you think?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'm listening. Ruth left me more than just the cottage. A lot more. And I need an attorney who can help me protect all of it from people who assume I'm too poor and too incompetent to fight back." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Miss Morrison, perhaps we should meet in person. Today, if possible. I think there are things about Ruth's planning that we need to discuss." They met at Walsh's office that afternoon. Lila brought copies of everything. The Morrison Holdings documents, the property deeds, the financial statements, Ruth's confessional letters, and the evidence about Diana Morrison's stolen custody. Walsh read through it all, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding to something that looked like grim satisfaction. "Ruth prepared for this," he said finally. "She knew her family would challenge anything she left you. That's why she structured everything the way she did." "What do you mean?" Walsh pulled out a file Lila hadn't seen before. "Ruth came to me 4 years ago with a plan. She wanted to build you a separate estate that her family couldn't touch, couldn't contest, couldn't access. Everything she put in your name through Morrison Holdings was done with ironclad legal documentation. Every property transfer, every account opening, every business filing, all of it was structured to be unassailable." He showed Lila documents proving that the properties had been legally transferred years ago, that all taxes had been properly paid, that every filing was complete and accurate. Ruth had been building Lila's empire with the kind of meticulous legal care that would survive any challenge. "But why did she leave me just the cottage in the official will?" Lila asked. "To protect you. If Ruth had left you everything in the will, your adoptive family would have immediately challenged it. By leaving you something that appeared worthless while the real assets remained hidden, she gave them no reason to dig deeper. She assumed you'd find the cottage, discover the truth, and then have the resources to fight back if they eventually came after you. Which is exactly what's happening." Walsh nodded. "But here's the important part. The petition they filed only challenges the cottage inheritance. They don't know about Morrison Holdings yet, which means we have a window of opportunity to secure everything before they realize what you actually own." "What kind of opportunity?" "We file a counterpetition. We present evidence of Ruth's competency. We demonstrate that the cottage was legitimately left to you. And while they're focused on fighting over what they think is a worthless property, we make absolutely certain that your actual assets are protected." It was a strategy Ruth would have appreciated. Let them fight over the decoy while the real treasure remained hidden. But Lila's satisfaction was short-lived. That evening, she received a call from Patricia at Morrison Holdings. "Miss Morrison, we have a problem. One of our properties was visited today by someone claiming to be conducting a county inspection. But when I called the county office, they had no record of sending an inspector to that address. Lila's stomach dropped. Someone was scouting the properties? It appears so. And there's more. I received a call this afternoon from someone claiming to be from the IRS, asking questions about Morrison Holdings' tax filings and ownership structure. The call seemed legitimate at first, but when I asked for credentials, they hung up. Paul and Miriam were investigating. They didn't know what Lila owned yet, but they knew she had something. They were searching for assets they could claim were part of Ruth's estate or that had been fraudulently obtained. Patricia, how secure are our records? Everything is properly filed and documented. But Miss Morrison, if they're actively investigating, they'll eventually find Morrison Holdings business registration. Once they do, they'll see your name on the ownership documents. And then they'll claim I stole it from Ruth. That would be the logical attack, yes. They'll argue that you manipulated Ruth into transferring property while she was dying, that you took advantage of a sick woman's confusion to enrich yourself. Lila thought about the legal documents Walsh had shown her, the meticulous records Ruth had kept. Everything was legitimate. But would that matter when a wealthy white family claimed the black adopted daughter had stolen from them? What do we do? Lila asked. We prepare for them to find out. We secure every document, every receipt, every piece of evidence showing that these transfers were legitimate and properly executed years ago. And we find allies who can testify to Ruth's competency and her intentions. That night, Lila couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the chess game she was playing against people who'd spent 24 years treating her like she was stupid. They thought they knew her capabilities. They thought they knew her limits. They were about to discover they'd been wrong. But the next morning brought a new complication. Lila arrived at her design firm office to find her boss, Gregory, waiting for her with an uncomfortable expression. Lila, we need to talk. Someone called yesterday asking questions about your employment, your salary, your performance. They claimed to be from a background check company, but some of the questions seemed odd. What kind of questions? Things about your financial situation. Whether you'd mentioned any inheritances or windfalls. Whether your work performance had changed recently. I didn't answer most of it, but I wanted to warn you that someone is digging into your life. Paul and Miriam were building a case. They were gathering evidence that Lila was financially unstable, that she had motivation to steal from Ruth, that any sudden wealth she possessed must have been obtained illegally. Thank you for telling me, Lila said, her mind racing. There's something else. Gregory looked even more uncomfortable. I also received a call from someone claiming to be your uncle. He suggested that you might be going through some personal difficulties following your mother's death, and that you might need time off work to deal with family legal matters. He seemed very concerned about your well-being. The manipulation was subtle but effective. Paul was planting the idea that Lila was unstable, struggling, potentially unreliable. If she suddenly started fighting back or claiming she owned property, people would remember that her concerned uncle had warned them she wasn't thinking clearly. I'm fine, Lila said. My uncle is overstating things. Gregory nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. The seed had been planted. From now on, anything Lila did would be viewed through the lens of potential instability. She left work early and went back to the cottage. She needed to think, needed to plan, needed to figure out how to fight people who were systematically building a narrative that would discredit anything she said. The cottage felt different now that she knew its secrets. Walking through rooms that had seemed abandoned, she could see Ruth's careful maintenance. The working utilities, the solid floors, the deliberately shabby exterior that hid a house that was perfectly livable. Ruth had been hiding in plain sight for years. Maybe Lila needed to do the same. She was in the basement going through files when she heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy footsteps. Multiple people walking through the cottage like they owned it. Lila's heart raced. She quietly closed the filing cabinet and moved toward the basement stairs, staying low enough that she couldn't be seen through the doorway. Through the gap under the door, she could see 3 pairs of legs moving through the living room. She recognized Paul's expensive shoes and Miriam's designer boots. The third person was a stranger. As you can see, the property needs significant work, Paul was saying. Foundation issues, electrical problems, general safety concerns. The current owner doesn't have the resources or experience to handle this kind of renovation project. But the location is excellent, the stranger replied. With the right investment, this could be very profitable. How motivated is the owner to sell? She's coming around, Miriam said. The legal complications with the inheritance are helping her understand that selling might be her best option. We're working on convincing her that a quick sale is preferable to a lengthy court battle she can't afford. They'd brought a buyer to tour her property without permission. They were showing her cottage to someone while discussing how to pressure her into selling. Lila pulled out her phone and started recording audio. If they were going to build a case against her, she'd build one right back. What price range are we discussing? The stranger asked. The property itself is probably worth around $80,000 in its current condition, Paul said. But we're confident we can convince the owner to accept $50,000. She's motivated by avoiding legal problems more than maximizing value. They were planning to buy her property for $50,000 and immediately flip it for $80,000. Using the legal pressure, they were applying to force her into a deal that would profit them $30,000 minimum. And you're certain you can facilitate this sale? The stranger asked. You have the authority to negotiate on the owner's behalf? We're family, Miriam said smoothly. As executor of the estate, Paul has significant influence over how the property issues are resolved. The owner is young and inexperienced. She'll listen to family guidance. More lies. Paul wasn't the executor of anything related to the cottage. But they were positioning themselves as having authority they didn't possess, probably planning to pressure Lila into signing over power of attorney or some other document that would give them actual control. The owner might resist initially, Paul continued. But once she understands the legal expenses involved in fighting the competency challenge, she'll see that accepting our offer is the smart financial decision. Lila kept recording as they continued the tour, listening to them discuss renovation plans and profit margins for property they didn't own and had no right to sell. When they finally left, she stayed in the basement for another 20 minutes, making sure they were really gone. Then she called Walsh immediately. They just gave me a trespassing tour of my own property, Lila said, explaining what she'd overheard. I have audio of them discussing how to pressure me into selling and planning to flip it for profit. Send me that recording, Walsh said, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. They just made a serious mistake. Bringing unauthorized buyers to someone else's property, misrepresenting their authority to sell, discussing strategies to coerce the owner. That's not just unethical, it's potentially actionable. What do I do now? Now we stop playing defense and start playing offense. We file a restraining order barring them from the property. We send cease and desist letters about their unauthorized access. And we prepare to reveal exactly what you own when the time is right. Won't that make them angrier? Won't they escalate? Absolutely, Walsh said. But right now they think they're hunting someone weak and unprepared. We need to make them understand they're actually fighting someone who has more resources, better documentation, and the law on her side. Sometimes the best defense is making your opponent realize they picked the wrong target. Lila thought about Diana's letters in the safety deposit box, about Ruth's meticulous planning, about 24 years of being underestimated by people who thought they were better than her. Let's do it, she said. Let's make them understand who they're really dealing with. That night, Lila compiled everything she had. Audio recordings of Paul and Miriam trespassing, financial records of the money they'd taken from her accounts, documentation of their lies about Ruth's competency, evidence of their unauthorized property tours. She was building a case not just to defend herself, but to expose them, to show everyone who'd spent years treating her like charity exactly what she was capable of when they pushed her too far. The Henderson family thought they were pressuring a frightened young woman into submission. They were about to discover they'd been systematically creating evidence for their own destruction. And Lila was just getting started. The emergency family meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at the Henderson estate. Paul called Lila personally, his voice carrying a threat barely disguised as concern. We've discovered some irregularities in Ruth's financial records that need immediate attention. You need to be here with all documentation related to any assets Ruth may have transferred to you. If you don't show up, we'll have no choice but to involve authorities. Lila's hands were shaking when she hung up. They'd found Morrison Holdings. Somehow, despite all the precautions, they'd discovered her real estate empire. She called Walsh immediately. "They know," she said. "I don't know how, but they know about the properties." "We expected this eventually," Walsh said, though his voice was tense. "The question is what they plan to do with the information. Don't go to that meeting alone. I'll meet you there. What if they've already filed charges? What if they've convinced the police I stole from Ruth? Then we show them the documentation proving everything was legitimate. Lila, you haven't done anything wrong. Ruth transferred those properties legally years ago. You're the rightful owner." But Lila knew how these things worked. She'd seen enough news stories about black people accused of crimes they didn't commit, arrested for being in places they had every right to be. Documentation didn't always matter when people had already decided you were guilty. The Henderson estate looked exactly as it had during every uncomfortable family gathering Lila had attended over the years. Imposing stone facade, manicured lawn, the kind of old money elegance that made you feel poor just looking at it. She'd spent her childhood feeling like an intruder in this house. Now she was about to walk back in knowing she was wealthier than the people who'd made her feel like charity. Walsh met her in the circular driveway. "Whatever happens in there, stay calm. Don't admit to anything, don't sign anything, and don't let them provoke you into saying something they can use against you later." "What if they already have me arrested?" "They won't. If they had real evidence of wrongdoing, police would be here. This is intimidation, nothing more." But when they walked into the house, Lila's confidence evaporated. The living room had been converted into an interrogation room. Paul sat behind a large desk with file folders spread out like evidence exhibits. Miriam stood near the door like a guard. Cousins Jennifer and Brad were positioned by the windows. And sitting in chairs facing the desk were two people in dark suits who looked official and threatening. "Lila, thank you for coming," Paul said with false warmth. "This is Detective Sarah Mitchell from the Financial Crimes Unit, and this is Agent Robert Taylor from the District Attorney's Office. They have some questions about irregularities they've discovered in Ruth's estate." Lila's legs went weak. They'd actually called law enforcement. They'd escalated this to criminal investigation. Walsh stepped forward. "I'm David Walsh, Miss Morrison's attorney. Before we proceed, I need to see credentials and understand the exact nature of this inquiry." Detective Mitchell pulled out identification, and Lila's stomach dropped when she realized this was real. These were actual law enforcement officials, not actors Paul had hired. "Miss Morrison," Mitchell said, "we've received reports of potentially fraudulent manipulation of estate documents and unauthorized access to family business accounts. We need to ask you some questions about properties and financial assets registered in your name." "My client is happy to cooperate," Walsh said smoothly. "But first, who filed these reports? And what specific allegations are being made?" Agent Taylor opened a folder. "Paul Henderson has provided evidence suggesting that Ruth Henderson may have been unduly influenced to transfer significant assets to Miss Morrison during a period when her decision-making capacity was compromised by illness. We've also received reports of unauthorized access to family business accounts and suspicious financial transfers." Lila found her voice. "What assets? What transfers?" Paul opened one of his folders and pulled out documents Lila recognized with horror. Property deeds from Morrison Holdings. Bank statements showing her accounts. Business incorporation papers with her name listed as owner. These documents show that someone has been systematically transferring estate assets into accounts controlled by you, Miss Morrison. The transfers began shortly after Ruth's terminal diagnosis and continued until just days before her death. It was a complete lie. The properties had been transferred years ago, not during Ruth's illness. But Paul was presenting it as if everything had happened in the final months when Ruth was dying. "That's not accurate," Walsh said firmly. "Those properties were transferred between 3 and 12 years ago, long before Mrs. Henderson became ill. We have dated documentation proving the timeline." "Do you?" Miriam asked, speaking for the first time. "Because the documents we have show transfer dates from this year. They show a pattern of a young woman taking advantage of a dying woman's vulnerability." She pulled out more papers, and Lila's heart stopped. They were property deeds, but the dates had been altered. Someone had created false documents showing recent transfers, forging Ruth's signature to make it look like everything had happened in the final months of her life. Those are forgeries, Lila said, her voice shaking. The real deeds are dated years ago. Someone changed the dates to make it look like I stole from Ruth. That's a serious accusation, Detective Mitchell said. Do you have the original documents? They're in my attorney's possession, Walsh said. And I can assure you that every transfer was properly executed, legally filed, and taxed appropriately at the time they occurred. Paul smiled coldly. Then it should be easy to prove which documents are authentic. But until we can verify that, we need to freeze all assets in question to prevent further fraud. You can't freeze my property, Lila said, panic rising. Those assets are mine. Ruth gave them to me years ago. If that's true, you'll get them back once the investigation is complete, Agent Taylor said. But if these transfers occurred while Ruth was dying, as the evidence suggests, then they may constitute elder abuse and financial exploitation. Lila looked at Walsh, silently begging him to fix this. But even Walsh looked shaken. Someone had gone to enormous effort to create false documents, and until they could prove which version was real, law enforcement had to take the allegations seriously. I want to be clear, Walsh said. My client has committed no crime. Every asset she owns was legally transferred to her by Ruth Henderson over a period of many years. We will provide documentation proving this, but freezing assets based on forged evidence is inappropriate. We'll need to examine all documentation, Mitchell said. Miss Morrison, do you have access to the properties in question? Yes, but they're mine. Ruth left them to me. Miss Morrison, Mitchell's voice took on a harder edge. We need you to provide immediate access to all properties, all financial accounts, and all business records associated with Morrison Holdings. Refusing to cooperate will be seen as obstruction. Jennifer spoke from her position by the window. This is so sad. We tried to help Lila understand that selling the cottage was her best option, but instead she created this elaborate fraud scheme to steal from our aunt. I guess desperation makes people do terrible things. The narrative was already set. Lila was the desperate adopted daughter who'd stolen from her dying mother. The evidence had been manufactured, the authorities had been called, and now she was being backed into a corner where cooperation meant surrendering everything Ruth had built for her. My client will not be providing access to her private property without proper legal warrants, Walsh said. And she certainly won't be doing so based on forged documents presented by people who have a financial interest in seizing those assets. Paul's expression hardened. David, I don't think you understand the seriousness of what's happening here. Lila has been systematically stealing from Ruth for years. We have evidence. We have witnesses. We have documentation showing a pattern of manipulation and fraud. What witnesses? Lila asked, her voice breaking. Miriam pulled out more papers. Nurses who cared for Ruth during her final months. They've provided statements saying you were alone with Ruth for hours at a time, that you were seen going through her papers, that Ruth seemed confused and disoriented whenever you left. More lies. Ruth had been sharp and clear until the very end. But nurses who'd seen Lila visiting regularly could easily be convinced to remember things differently, especially if Paul and Miriam were paying them. We also have statements from Ruth's neighbors, Brad added, saying you removed boxes from her apartment after her death. Boxes that may have contained documents related to her estate. I took my own belongings, Lila said, but her voice sounded weak even to herself. Things Ruth had kept for me over the years. Or evidence of fraudulent transfers that you needed to hide, Paul suggested. Walsh put a hand on Lila's arm, warning her to stop talking. But Detective Mitchell was already standing. Miss Morrison, I'm going to need you to come to the station to make a formal statement. You're not under arrest, but we need to get your version of events on record while we investigate these allegations. She'll come voluntarily tomorrow, Walsh said, with full documentation proving the legitimacy of her assets. Tonight, Mitchell said firmly. These are serious allegations involving significant financial fraud. We need to move quickly to preserve evidence and prevent further asset dissipation. Lila understood what was happening. They were separating her from her attorney, getting her alone and frightened, hoping she'd say something incriminating or sign something without fully understanding what it meant. I'll accompany my client, Walsh said. That's your right, Mitchell agreed. But Miss Morrison, I want to be clear. If we determine that these assets were fraudulently obtained, you will face criminal charges. Financial exploitation of an elderly person is a felony. You could be looking at significant prison time. The room spun. Prison. They were threatening her with prison for owning property Ruth had legally given her years ago. They'd forged documents, manufactured evidence, and called law enforcement to intimidate her into surrendering everything. "This is outrageous," Walsh said, his voice rising. "You're threatening my client with prison based on documents that are clearly falsified. We will prove that every asset Miss Morrison owns was legally transferred years ago, and when we do, there will be consequences for this malicious prosecution." "We look forward to seeing your proof," Paul said calmly. "But until then, Lila needs to understand the seriousness of her situation. Financial crimes against family members are taken very seriously by prosecutors." Miriam moved toward Lila with an expression that managed to convey both pity and satisfaction. "Lila, honey, this doesn't have to destroy your life. If you cooperate fully, if you return the assets you took and accept responsibility, the prosecutors might be willing to work out a deal. You're young. You made mistakes. People will understand if you just admit what you did." They wanted a confession. They wanted Lila to admit to crimes she hadn't committed, to sign away property that was legally hers, to accept their version of events that painted her as a thief and them as victims. And if she refused, they'd have her arrested. They'd drag her through criminal prosecution. They'd use the legal system to destroy her the same way Ruth's family had used it to steal her from Diana. Lila looked around the room at the family who'd spent 24 years making her feel like she didn't belong. At the law enforcement officers who'd been fed lies and forged evidence. At the trap that had been carefully constructed to give her only two choices: surrender or be destroyed. She thought about Diana Morrison sending birthday cards that were never delivered. About Ruth building an empire in secret and documenting every step to protect Lila from exactly this scenario. About 24 years of being underestimated and excluded and treated like charity. And she realized that if she surrendered now, if she let them intimidate her into giving up what Ruth had built, then everything Diana had fought for and everything Ruth had tried to make right would be lost. "I didn't steal anything," Lila said quietly. "Ruth gave me those properties legally years ago. She documented everything specifically because she knew her family would try to take them away from me. And I'm not signing anything or admitting to anything I didn't do." Paul's expression shifted to something colder. "Then you leave us no choice. Detective Mitchell, I think it's time to escalate this investigation. I want full forensic accounting of every transaction, every transfer, every document. And I want charges filed immediately if there's any evidence of fraud." Mitchell nodded. "Miss Morrison, you'll need to come with us now." Walsh stood. "I'm accompanying my client, and I'm advising her to answer no questions until we've had time to review all allegations and evidence privately." As Lila stood to leave, Miriam called out one more time. "Lila, you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. Ruth would be heartbroken to see you acting this way. She raised you better than this." The invocation of Ruth's disappointment was designed to wound, to make Lila doubt herself one more time. But standing in that mansion surrounded by people who'd stolen her childhood and were now trying to steal her future, Lila felt something shift inside her. She wasn't the scared little girl anymore. She wasn't the grateful adopted daughter accepting scraps. She was the owner of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire that Ruth had built specifically to give her power these people couldn't take away. They thought they'd cornered her. They thought forged documents and threats of prison would break her. They had no idea what was coming. The interrogation at the police station lasted 4 hours. Detective Mitchell asked the same questions over and over, rephrasing them slightly each time, trying to catch Lila in an inconsistency. Walsh sat beside her, occasionally objecting or advising her not to answer, but even he looked worried as the questions became more aggressive. "Let's go over this again, Miss Morrison. You're claiming that Ruth Henderson transferred properties worth millions of dollars to you over several years, but you never mentioned this to anyone? Not family, not friends, not co-workers. I didn't know about them until after Ruth died," Lila said for what felt like the 100th time. "She managed everything through Morrison Holdings without telling me. That's convenient. A secret real estate empire that just happens to make you wealthy, managed by someone who conveniently can't confirm your story because she's dead." The property manager can confirm it. Patricia Turner has records of everything. Mitchell consulted her notes. Patricia Turner, who has worked for Morrison Holdings for 8 years. The same Patricia Turner who receives a salary paid from the accounts in question. She has every incentive to support your story. Lila's head was pounding. They were twisting everything, making legitimate business relationships sound suspicious. Patricia wasn't lying to protect Lila. She was telling the truth. But Mitchell was presenting it as if everyone who confirmed Lila's story must be part of the fraud. Miss Morrison, let me be direct. We have witnesses saying Ruth was confused in her final months. We have documents showing recent property transfers. We have evidence of your financial struggles before Ruth's death. And we have a pattern of behavior consistent with financial exploitation of an elderly, vulnerable woman. Those documents are forged, Lila said, her voice breaking from exhaustion. Someone changed the dates to make it look like the transfers happened recently. The real deeds show transfers from years ago. Then where are these real deeds? Why do the documents filed with the county show recent dates? Walsh leaned forward. Because someone filed false documents to replace the originals. My client is the victim of fraud, not the perpetrator. Or your client is very good at creating cover stories. Mitchell closed her folder. Miss Morrison, here's what I think happened. You were raised by a wealthy woman who gave you a comfortable life. But you wanted more. You wanted the wealth her biological family was going to inherit. So you started manipulating Ruth, convincing her to transfer assets to you. And when she was dying and most vulnerable, you forged her signature on documents that would make you rich. That's not what happened. Then prove it. Show us the original documents with the earlier dates. Show us evidence that Ruth intended this. Show us anything that proves your story isn't an elaborate fraud. We will, Walsh said. As soon as you provide us with the allegedly authentic documents you're basing your investigation on, we'll demonstrate that they're forgeries. The interrogation ended with no charges filed, but with a clear threat hanging over Lila's head. Mitchell made it clear that the investigation was just beginning and that criminal charges were likely once they'd completed their forensic analysis. When Lila finally left the station at nearly midnight, she was exhausted and terrified. Walsh drove her back to her apartment, and they sat in his car for a moment before she got out. They're building a strong case, Walsh admitted. Whoever forged those documents did professional work. Until we can prove they're fake, law enforcement has to take the allegations seriously. What do? We get ahead of this. We file the original property deeds with the court. We get expert testimony about the forgeries. We build our own case showing that you're the victim of a coordinated attempt by the Henderson family to steal your legitimate assets. And if that doesn't work? Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Then you need to prepare for the possibility of criminal charges. Financial exploitation of the elderly carries serious prison time in this state. Lila went up to her apartment feeling like her life was collapsing around her. Everything Ruth had built, everything she'd tried to protect Lila with, was being twisted into evidence of a crime. The empire that was supposed to give her power was becoming the weapon being used against her. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it and immediately wished she hadn't. It was a photo of Diana Morrison's grave. Fresh flowers had been placed on it, and written in the dirt beside the headstone were the words, "She died not knowing what you became." Lila's hands shook so badly she dropped the phone. They were threatening her using Diana's memory. They were finding new ways to hurt her, to remind her that she was alone and vulnerable. Another text came through. You can still make this stop. Return what you stole and accept responsibility. Or we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. It wasn't signed, but Lila knew it came from the Henderson family. They were escalating, trying to break her psychologically while the legal pressure mounted. She called Walsh immediately. They're threatening me. They're using Diana Morrison's grave to intimidate me. Document everything. Screenshot the texts. We'll add it to our harassment evidence. But Lila, you need to understand something. They're going to get worse before this is over. They've committed to destroying you, and they won't stop until they've succeeded or until you've proven they can't win. How do I prove that when they've forged documents and paid off witnesses? We find evidence they can't fake. We find the truth they can't hide. But finding the truth became harder when Lila lost her job the next morning. Gregory called her at 8 a.m., his voice apologetic but firm. Lila, I'm sorry, but we can't keep you on staff during a criminal investigation. The company's reputation is at stake, and having an employee facing potential fraud charges creates liability we can't accept. I haven't been charged with anything. I haven't done anything wrong. I believe you, but the board made the decision. We're going to have to let you go, effective immediately. Just like that, Lila's income was gone. The Henderson family had probably called her employer, probably planted stories about her being investigated for elder abuse. They were systematically destroying her life from every angle. Without her job, she couldn't afford her apartment. Without the Morrison Holdings accounts, which were now frozen pending investigation, she couldn't access the money that was legally hers. She was being forced into financial instability while fighting a legal battle that required resources she no longer had. That afternoon, Lila received an eviction notice. Her landlord had been contacted by someone claiming to be from a credit agency, warning that Lila was involved in financial fraud and might not be able to pay rent. The landlord wanted her out within 30 days. Everything was falling apart. Job gone. Housing unstable. Assets frozen. Criminal investigation pending. The Henderson family was destroying her life piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She went back to the cottage that evening, the only place she felt safe. But when she arrived, she found the locks had been changed. A notice on the door informed her that the property was under court-ordered seizure, pending resolution of the estate dispute. They'd taken the cottage. While Lila had been dealing with the interrogation and losing her job, Paul had gotten a judge to freeze the cottage pending his competency challenge. She couldn't even access the basement filing cabinets where Ruth had stored all the documentation that would prove her case. Lila sat in her car outside the cottage and finally let herself break. She tried to be strong, tried to fight back, tried to do what Ruth had prepared her to do. But it wasn't enough. The Henderson family had more money, more connections, more power. They could forge documents, bribe witnesses, manipulate law enforcement, and destroy her life systematically while she watched helplessly. She'd lost everything. Her job, her home, her inheritance, her future. All because Ruth had tried to make things right, and the Henderson family had decided that the black adopted daughter didn't deserve what she'd been given. Her phone rang. Walsh. Lila, I have bad news. The district attorney is moving forward with charges. They're filing tomorrow morning. Criminal financial exploitation, forgery, and fraud. The bond hearing is set for Friday. You need to prepare yourself for possible arrest. How is this happening? How can they charge me when I didn't do anything wrong? Because right now, their evidence looks credible and our evidence looks like it might be fabricated to cover your tracks. We need time to prove the forgeries, but the DA isn't giving us that time. They're rushing to charge you before we can build our defense. What do I do? Walsh was quiet for a moment. You need to consider accepting a plea deal. If they offer one, it might be your best option. A plea could mean probation instead of prison, a chance to rebuild your life instead of losing years fighting charges in court. But I didn't do anything wrong. I know, but sometimes the legal system doesn't care about innocence as much as it cares about evidence, and right now their evidence is stronger than ours. After hanging up, Lila sat in her car outside the cottage she couldn't enter and thought about Diana Morrison. Diana had spent 23 years fighting a legal system that had stolen her daughter. She'd gathered evidence, filed petitions, begged for justice. And she'd lost every single battle. Now Lila was fighting the same system, facing the same kind of manufactured evidence and institutional power. And like Diana, she was losing. She thought about the plea deal Walsh had mentioned. She could admit to crimes she didn't commit, accept probation, surrender all the property Ruth had given her. She could go back to being nobody, to having nothing, to accepting that people like the Henderson family always won. Or she could keep fighting even though it looked hopeless. Even though she'd probably lose. Even though the cost might be prison time and permanent criminal record. As she sat there in the dark, her phone buzzed with one more text. This one was from Patricia at Morrison Holdings. Miss Morrison, I know things look bad right now, but Mrs. Henderson prepared for this exact scenario. There's something in the cottage basement you haven't found yet. Fourth filing cabinet, false bottom in the top drawer. She said you'd know what to do with it when the time came. Don't give up. Not yet. Lila stared at the text. A false bottom in the filing cabinet. Something Ruth had hidden even more carefully than the property deeds and letters. Something she'd saved for the moment when everything seemed lost. But the cottage was sealed. Lila couldn't access it without breaking the court order, which would add another crime to the list she was already facing. She looked up at the cottage, at the basement windows barely visible in the darkness. Whatever Ruth had hidden there might be the evidence that would save her. Or it might be nothing at all. But staying in her car, accepting defeat, letting the Henderson family win, that would guarantee she lost everything. Lila made a decision. She was already facing criminal charges. Already losing her job, her home, her future. What difference would one more crime make if it meant finding the truth? She got out of her car and walked around to the back of the cottage, looking for a way in. The basement window was old, the latch probably easy to force. She could get in, find whatever Ruth had hidden, and get out before anyone knew she'd been there. Or she could get caught, get arrested, and make everything worse. Standing in the darkness behind the cottage, Lila understood finally what Diana Morrison must have felt all those years ago. The desperation of fighting a system designed to defeat you. The calculation of whether breaking the law was worth it if it might lead to justice. The terrible choice between surrender and risk. Diana had chosen to keep fighting until the day she died. Ruth had spent years building weapons for Lila to use in exactly this battle. Lila wasn't going to surrender. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance Ruth had left her one more tool to fight back with. She forced the basement window open and climbed inside, knowing she was probably making the worst decision of her life. But also knowing that sometimes the only way to win was to risk everything. Whatever Ruth had hidden in that false bottom drawer, Lila was about to find it. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to turn the tide in a war she was currently losing. The basement was exactly as Lila had left it, filing cabinets standing like silent witnesses to everything Ruth had built. She moved quickly to the fourth cabinet, heart pounding with the knowledge that she was breaking a court order just by being here. The top drawer opened with familiar smoothness. Property deeds, just like before. But Patricia had said there was a false bottom. Lila ran her hands along the inside of the drawer, feeling for anything unusual. There, a slight ridge along the bottom edge. She pressed it, and a section of the drawer bottom popped up slightly, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a single flash drive and another letter from Ruth. Lila's hands trembled as she pocketed the flash drive and unfolded the letter. Ruth's handwriting was shakier than usual, written in the final weeks of her life. My dearest Lila, if you're reading this, it means they've done exactly what I feared. They've twisted everything I built for you into evidence of a crime. They've used the system to try to take from you what they couldn't take legally. They've proven once again that the Henderson family will do anything to prevent you from claiming what's rightfully yours. The flash drive contains evidence that will destroy them completely. But Lila, you need to understand what using it means. On that drive are recordings of conversations between Paul, Miriam, and me over the past 5 years. Conversations where they admitted to bribing officials during your adoption. Conversations where they discussed Diana Morrison as a problem that needed to be eliminated. Conversations where they planned exactly how to steal your inheritance if I ever tried to leave you anything. Lila stopped breathing. Discussions where Diana Morrison was a problem that needed to be eliminated. Ruth was suggesting that Diana's death hadn't been an accident. She forced herself to keep reading. 6 months before Diana died, she contacted a lawyer about challenging your adoption. She'd found evidence that the medical reports were falsified, that social workers had been bribed. She was going to expose everything the Henderson family had done to steal you from her. Paul and Miriam found out about her plans. I have recordings of them discussing how to stop her. I don't have proof that they caused her accident, but I have evidence that they knew about her legal challenge and that they considered her a threat that needed to be neutralized. Diana Morrison died in a single-car accident 3 days before her meeting with that lawyer. Police ruled it an accident, but the timing was too convenient. And on this flash drive, you'll hear Paul and Miriam discussing Diana's problem being resolved just days after her death. Lila's vision blurred. They'd killed Diana. Or had her killed. The family that had stolen Lila from her mother had then murdered that mother when she'd tried to get her daughter back. I was a coward, Lila. I knew what they'd done, or at least suspected, and I said nothing. I was too afraid of what exposing them would mean. Too afraid of losing my family, even though they'd never really been my family after I adopted you. Too afraid of facing consequences for my role in stealing you from Diana. So instead, I built you this empire. I documented everything. I prepared weapons for you to use when they inevitably came after you. And I left you with a choice I was too weak to make myself. You can use what's on this flash drive to destroy the Henderson family completely. The recordings prove they bribed officials, manipulated your adoption, and possibly murdered Diana. You can expose them, press charges, make them pay for everything they've done. But doing that means exposing my role too. It means admitting that I stole you from a loving mother through fraud and corruption. It means accepting that the woman who raised you was a criminal who built your fortune on guilt and stolen love. The choice is yours, Lila. You can use this evidence to save yourself and destroy them. Or you can walk away, accept the plea deal, and try to build a life without the fortune I tried to give you. I won't blame you whichever you choose. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't ask to be stolen from Diana. You didn't ask to be raised by a woman who loved you, but couldn't stop her family from terrorizing you. You didn't ask for wealth built on guilt or weapons forged from confession. But if you do choose to fight, know that I believe you're strong enough to survive what comes next. Know that Diana would be proud of you. And know that everything I did wrong, everything I built right, all of it was because I loved you, even though I had no right to. Use the evidence or don't. But either way, know that you deserved so much better than what my family put you through. I'm sorry for everything, sweetheart. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to make this right while I was alive. With all my love, Ruth. Lila sat on the basement floor clutching the flash drive and feeling like the weight of 24 years of lies was crushing her. Ruth had known. She'd known the Henderson family had probably killed Diana, and she'd said nothing. She'd protected them while building Lila weapons to use against them someday. But using those weapons meant destroying Ruth's reputation too. It meant admitting that the woman who'd raised her was part of a criminal conspiracy. It meant exposing secrets that would taint every happy memory, every Sunday morning pancake breakfast, every moment Lila had felt loved. Her phone buzzed. Walsh. Lila, where are you? The DA's office just called. They're filing charges first thing tomorrow morning. We're out of time. I found something, Lila said, her voice hollow. Ruth left evidence. Recordings that prove the Henderson family forged documents and manipulated my adoption. Maybe even prove they killed Diana Morrison. Silence on the other end. Then, what kind of recordings? Conversations between Ruth and her family over several years. Admissions of bribery, fraud, conspiracy. Everything we need to prove I'm innocent, and they're the criminals. That's incredible. That could change everything. Where are these recordings? Lila looked at the flash drive in her hand. But using them means exposing Ruth too. It means admitting she was part of the conspiracy. It means destroying her reputation and proving that everything she did for me was built on crimes she committed. Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Lila, I know this is hard, but you're facing prison time for crimes you didn't commit. Ruth is gone. She can't be prosecuted. But you're still here, still fighting for your life. You have to use whatever weapons you have. Even if it means destroying the memory of the only person who ever loved me. Did she love you? Or did she steal you from someone who actually loved you, and then spend 24 years trying to buy forgiveness with real estate? The question cut deep because Lila had been asking herself the same thing. Had Ruth really loved her, or had Lila just been Ruth's guilt project, the living reminder of a crime that couldn't be undone? I don't know anymore, Lila admitted. Then focus on what you do know. The Henderson family is trying to destroy you. They've forged evidence, bribed witnesses, and manipulated law enforcement. They possibly murdered your birth mother. And if you don't stop them now, you'll lose everything and spend years in prison for crimes they committed. Lila closed her eyes. Walsh was right. This wasn't really a choice. It was survival. But part of her still wanted to believe that Ruth had loved her, that the pancake breakfasts and property visits and quiet conversations had been real. Using the flash drive meant accepting that maybe none of it was real, that she'd been a guilt project all along. I need time to think, Lila said. We don't have time. Charges are being filed tomorrow. If we're going to use this evidence, we need to move now. Tonight. And if I use it, what happens? We take the recordings to the DA immediately. We prove that the Henderson family forged the property deeds, that they've been conducting a coordinated campaign to steal your assets. We expose their role in your fraudulent adoption. And we present evidence suggesting they may have caused Diana Morrison's death. Will that definitely stop the charges against me? Walsh hesitated. It should, but nothing is guaranteed. They could argue the recordings are fabricated or taken out of context. But Lila, it's your best chance. Maybe your only chance. Lila thought about Diana Morrison teaching school less than an hour away, sending birthday cards that were never delivered, dying on her way to expose the truth. Diana had fought until her last day. She'd never stopped trying to get Lila back. And Ruth, whatever her motivations, had spent years building Lila the tools to finish what Diana started. To expose the Henderson family and make them pay for everything they'd done. Okay, Lila said quietly. Let's do it. Let's use the recordings. I'll meet you at my office in an hour. Bring the flash drive and anything else Ruth left that supports your case. After hanging up, Lila sat in the basement for a few more minutes, surrounded by filing cabinets full of Ruth's careful documentation. Part of her wanted to believe that Ruth had loved her despite everything, that the empire Ruth built and the weapons she left behind were proof of genuine care, not just guilt management. But another part of her understood that love and crime weren't mutually exclusive. Ruth could have loved her and still been a criminal. She could have genuinely cared while also using Lila to ease her conscience about stolen motherhood. The flash drive in Lila's hand represented the end of Ruth's reputation and maybe the end of the Henderson family's power. But it also represented justice for Diana Morrison, who died trying to expose the truth. And it represented Lila's only real chance at freedom. She climbed out of the basement window and got back in her car, the flash drive secure in her pocket. Whatever happened next, whatever the recordings revealed, there was no going back. She'd made her choice. She would fight. She would expose the Henderson family. She would seek justice for Diana and for herself, even if it meant destroying Ruth's memory in the process. Because sometimes love wasn't enough. Sometimes truth mattered more than loyalty. And sometimes the only way to honor someone's memory was to finish the fight they'd been too afraid to start. As Lila drove toward Walsh's office, her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Last chance. Return what you stole and accept the plea deal. After tonight, the offer expires and you'll face the full consequences of your crimes. Lila deleted the text without responding. Let them think she was considering surrender. Let them think they'd broken her. Tomorrow morning they'd discover that the frightened adopted daughter they'd been terrorizing had just become the most dangerous threat they'd ever faced. And this time, she had the evidence to back it up. An hour later, Lila sat in Walsh's office while he loaded the flash drive onto his computer. The recordings were organized by date, spanning 5 years of conversations Ruth had secretly recorded with her family. Walsh started with the most recent ones, the conversations from the months before Ruth's death. Paul and Miriam's voices came through clearly, discussing their plans for after Ruth died. Once Ruth is gone, we need to make sure Lila doesn't get anything substantial, Paul was saying. She's been sniffing around the property records, asking questions about Ruth's investments. We can't let her discover what Ruth's been hiding. What if Ruth left her something in the will? Miriam asked. Then we challenge it. We claim Ruth was incompetent, that Lila manipulated her. We've been documenting Ruth's decline for months. We have nurses who'll testify she was confused. You've already paid them? Of course. Everything is arranged. When the time comes, we'll have all the evidence we need to prove Lila exploited Ruth. Walsh paused the recording. They were planning this months before Ruth died. They were setting up the competency challenge before Ruth even wrote her final will. Keep going, Lila said, her voice hard. The next recording was even more damning. Ruth's voice this time, confronting Paul about Diana Morrison. Paul, I know you had something to do with Diana's accident. She was about to expose what we did during the adoption, and then suddenly she's dead. Paul's voice was cold in his response. Ruth, Diana Morrison's death was investigated and ruled an accident. You're paranoid. I'm not stupid. She was on her way to file legal papers, and her car mysteriously went off the road. No skid marks, no brake evidence, just a sudden accident that solved our problem. Our problem? You said it yourself. Diana was going to destroy this family with her accusations. Someone had to handle it. You killed her. You killed that woman because she wanted her daughter back. I protected this family, just like I always have. And Ruth, you might want to remember that you're part of this too. You're the one who stole that baby in the first place. Diana Morrison's blood is on your hands as much as mine. Walsh stopped the recording again. That's a confession. Paul essentially admitted to causing Diana's death. Is it enough to charge him? It's enough to reopen the investigation into her death. Combined with the timeline and the circumstances, it's very compelling evidence of foul play. They listened to more recordings. Conversations where Miriam discussed bribing social workers during Lila's adoption. Conversations where Paul talked about forging property deeds to make Lila's inheritance look fraudulent. Conversations where both of them discussed how to manipulate law enforcement into charging Lila with crimes she didn't commit. By the time they'd reviewed everything, it was nearly 3 a.m. Walsh looked exhausted but energized. This changes everything. With these recordings, we can prove you're innocent, prove the Henderson family has been conducting a conspiracy against you, and potentially prove they're responsible for Diana Morrison's death. What do we do now? Now we take this directly to the district attorney and demand they drop all charges against you. We present evidence that you're the victim of a coordinated fraud, not the perpetrator. And we suggest very strongly that they need to be investigating the Henderson family instead. Lila nodded, but part of her felt hollow. She'd won. The evidence would clear her name and destroy her enemies. But it had cost her the last illusion she'd held about her life. The belief that Ruth had loved her purely, without guilt or criminal motivation. There's one more thing, Walsh said, pulling up a final file on the flash drive. Ruth left you a video message, dated 1 week before her death. He clicked play, and suddenly Ruth was on the screen, looking thin and tired but with clear eyes. Lila, sweetheart, if you're watching this, it means you found my recordings and you're preparing to use them. I want you to know that I understand why you're doing this, and I support your choice completely. Tears started falling before Lila could stop them. I know these recordings will destroy my reputation. I know people will remember me as a criminal instead of as your mother. And I know that might destroy whatever good memories you have of our time together. But Lila, you deserve justice more than I deserve a good reputation. Ruth's voice wavered slightly. I stole you from Diana Morrison because I wanted you selfishly, desperately. I loved you the moment I saw your picture, and I convinced myself that wanting you badly enough meant I deserved you. I was wrong. But even though how we became family was wrong, the love I felt for you was real. She wiped her eyes with a tissue. You didn't ask to be stolen. You didn't ask to be raised by a woman who loved you but couldn't stop her family from hurting you. You deserved better than what I gave you. But now I'm giving you what I should have given you all along. The truth, the weapons to fight back, and the freedom to make your own choices about who deserves your loyalty. Ruth leaned closer to the camera. Use the recordings, Lila. Destroy the Henderson family. Seek justice for Diana. And know that whatever damage it does to my memory, I accept it as the price I should have paid years ago. You're the innocent in all of this. You always were. The video ended, and Lila sat in Walsh's office crying for the complicated woman who'd raised her, stolen her, loved her, and finally given her the one thing she needed most, the power to choose her own destiny. Tomorrow the war would begin in earnest. Tomorrow the Henderson family would learn that they'd pushed the wrong person too far. And tomorrow, Lila would finally get justice for Diana Morrison and for herself. But tonight, in the quiet of Walsh's office, Lila mourned for Ruth. For the woman who'd made terrible choices but had tried, in her own flawed way, to make things right in the end. The district attorney's office opened at 8 a.m. Walsh and Lila were waiting in the lobby at 7:30, flash drive in hand and a folder full of supporting documentation. District Attorney Rebecca Carson agreed to see them immediately when Walsh mentioned he had evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving the Henderson family. She was a stern woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that suggested she didn't tolerate games. Mr. Walsh, I hope you have good reason for interrupting our prosecution of your client. We're prepared to file charges this morning. You're preparing to charge the wrong person, Walsh said, plugging the flash drive into Carson's computer. What we're about to show you proves that Lila Morrison is the victim of a coordinated fraud, and that the Henderson family has been conducting a criminal conspiracy for over 20 years. For the next hour, they played the recordings. Carson's expression shifted from skepticism to shock to grim anger as she listened to Paul and Miriam discussing their plans to forge documents, bribe witnesses, and frame Lila for crimes they'd committed. When the recording of Paul essentially admitting to Diana Morrison's death played, Carson stopped them. This conversation is about Diana Morrison? The woman who died in a car accident 6 months ago. Yes, Lila said, speaking for the first time. She was my birth mother. She was fighting to expose the fraudulent adoption that stole me from her. Paul and Miriam viewed her as a threat that needed to be eliminated. Carson replayed that section, making notes. This isn't a direct confession, but combined with the circumstances and timing, it's enough to reopen the investigation into her death. She looked at Lila. Did you know any of this before Ruth Henderson died? No. I didn't know Diana Morrison existed until I found Ruth's letters after the funeral. I didn't know I'd been stolen from her. And I didn't know the Henderson family had anything to do with her death until I found these recordings last night. Walsh presented the documentation, showing that the property deeds Paul had provided were forgeries. The real deeds, filed years earlier with proper documentation and tax records, proved that Lila had legitimately owned the properties long before Ruth's death. The Henderson family created false documents to make it appear that Miss Morrison had manipulated Ruth during her final illness, Walsh explained. They paid nurses to give false testimony about Ruth's competency. They pressured Miss Morrison's employer to fire her. They conducted unauthorized property searches. And they've been waging a systematic campaign to destroy her life and steal assets that legally belong to her. Carson listened to more recordings, her expression growing darker with each revelation. When they finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Miss Morrison, I owe you an apology. My office was preparing to prosecute you based on evidence that now appears to have been completely fabricated. The Henderson family has used law enforcement as a weapon against you, and I'm appalled that we didn't catch it sooner. So you're dropping the charges? Lila asked, barely able to believe what she was hearing. I'm dropping all charges immediately. More than that, I'm opening a criminal investigation into Paul Henderson, Miriam Henderson, and anyone else involved in this conspiracy. We'll be looking at fraud, forgery, bribery, obstruction of justice, and potentially murder in connection with Diana Morrison's death. Relief flooded through Lila so powerfully she had to grip the arms of her chair to stay steady. What happens now? Now we move quickly before they realize what's happening. I'm issuing arrest warrants for Paul and Miriam Henderson this morning. I'm also getting court orders to seize their financial records and communication devices. And I'm requesting that the police reopen Diana Morrison's death investigation with homicide detectives. Carson looked at Lila with something like sympathy. Miss Morrison, I want you to understand that this process is going to be difficult. The recordings implicate Ruth Henderson as well. While she can't be prosecuted because she's deceased, her role in your fraudulent adoption and in covering up Diana Morrison's potential murder will become public knowledge. I understand, Lila said quietly. Ruth knew that when she left me the recordings. She was willing to accept the consequences if it meant I could get justice. There's one more thing, Carson said. Given the nature of this case and the Henderson family's resources, they're going to fight back hard. They'll hire expensive lawyers. They'll try to discredit the recordings. They'll attack your character and your motivations. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny? Lila thought about 24 years of being made to feel small, of being treated as charity, of watching Ruth work herself to death while her wealthy family mocked the adopted daughter. She thought about Diana Morrison dying on her way to expose the truth. She thought about all the birthday cards she'd never received. I'm prepared, she said. Let them fight. I have the truth on my side now. Carson nodded with approval. Then let's get started. The arrests happened at 10 that morning. Police showed up at Paul's office and Miriam's home simultaneously with warrants and handcuffs. By noon, both of them were in custody, and the story was breaking on local news. Prominent Henderson family members arrested in fraud and conspiracy case. Investigation includes potential murder charges in death of Diana Morrison. Lila watched the news coverage from Walsh's office, seeing Paul and Miriam being let out in handcuffs, their expressions a mix of shock and rage. They'd thought they'd won. They'd thought they'd successfully destroyed Lila and stolen everything Ruth had built for her. They'd been wrong. Her phone started ringing immediately. Cousins Jennifer and Brad both called, their voicemails shifting from angry to panicked as they realized their parents had been arrested. "Lila, what did you do? What lies did you tell them? You've destroyed our family." Jennifer's voice was shrill with rage. "You've always been jealous of us, always wanted what we had. Now you're using the legal system to destroy innocent people just because Ruth didn't leave you enough in her will." But their words didn't hurt anymore. Lila knew the truth now. She knew she wasn't the problem, wasn't the charity case, wasn't the outsider who should be grateful for scraps. She was the victim who'd finally found the courage to fight back. By that evening, the news coverage had expanded to include details about Diana Morrison's death and the reopened investigation. A press conference was scheduled for the next morning where DA Carson would present some of the evidence and explain the charges. Walsh helped Lila prepare a statement. She'd be speaking publicly about what had been done to her and to Diana. It was terrifying and empowering in equal measure. The press conference was held on the courthouse steps, cameras and reporters crowding close as Carson stood at the podium with Lila and Walsh beside her. 6 months ago, Diana Morrison died in what appeared to be a tragic accident, Carson began. She was a beloved elementary school teacher, a dedicated educator, and a woman who'd spent 23 years searching for her daughter who'd been stolen from her through fraudulent adoption. The reporters started murmuring, cameras clicking rapidly. What we now know is that Diana Morrison died 3 days before a scheduled meeting with an attorney where she planned to file legal papers exposing corruption in that adoption. We have evidence suggesting her death was not an accident, but a calculated murder designed to prevent her from revealing the truth. Carson detailed the charges against Paul and Miriam without revealing the source of her evidence yet. She explained the forged property deeds, the bribed witnesses, the systematic campaign to destroy Lila's life. The victim in this case is Lila Morrison, Diana's daughter, who was stolen from her birth mother as a baby and has spent her entire life being manipulated and exploited by the family that took her. Today, we're seeking justice not just for Lila, but for Diana Morrison, who died trying to expose a truth that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Then Carson stepped aside and gestured for Lila to approach the microphone. Lila's hands were shaking, but she'd practiced this. She'd prepared for this moment. "My name is Lila Morrison," she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected. 24 years ago, I was stolen from my birth mother through a fraudulent adoption that involved bribery, falsified medical records, and corruption at every level. The family that took me spent my entire childhood making me feel like I should be grateful for their tolerance, like I was charity they'd graciously accepted. She looked directly at the cameras. But I wasn't charity. I was a stolen child. Diana Morrison fought for 23 years to expose what had been done to her and to me. She gathered evidence, filed petitions, and refused to give up hope that someday the truth would come out. Lila's voice caught, but she pushed through. 6 months ago, Diana died in what police ruled an accident. But I now know she was murdered to prevent her from exposing the truth. She died because powerful people decided that protecting their reputation was more important than a mother's love or a daughter's right to know where she came from. The reporters were completely silent now, cameras focused intently on her. The woman who raised me, Ruth Henderson, was part of the crime that stole me from Diana. But before she died, Ruth tried to make things right. She built me financial security, so I wouldn't depend on the family that had terrorized me. And she left me evidence to expose everything they'd done. Lila pulled out a photograph of Diana holding baby Lila in the hospital. "This is my mother, Diana Morrison, teacher, fighter, and the woman I never got to know because she was murdered before we could reunite. Today, I'm seeking justice for her and for every other person who's been victimized by people who think money and power put them above the law." She stepped back from the microphone, and the reporters erupted with questions. But Carson took over, explaining the legal process and the timeline for prosecution. As they left the courthouse, Lila felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just relief or vindication, but power. The power of speaking truth publicly. The power of refusing to be silent about crimes committed against her. The power of finally being believed. That afternoon, Lila received a call from Janet at Riverside Elementary, Diana's former school. "Miss Morrison, I saw your press conference. I wanted you to know that Diana would be so proud of you. She talked about you all the time, about hoping you'd grow up strong and confident. She'd be devastated by what was done to you, but she'd be so proud of how you're fighting back." "Thank you," Lila said, tears streaming down her face. "I wish I could have known her. She left something else for you at the school. A memory box she kept in her classroom. She made the students promise that if anything happened to her, they'd make sure it got to you someday. Would you like to come get it?" An hour later, Lila stood in Diana's former classroom, now used by another teacher. The memory box was a simple wooden container decorated with painted flowers and a small photo of baby Lila taped to the lid. Inside were teaching awards Diana had won, photos of her students over the years, and letters from parents thanking her for the impact she'd had on their children. At the very bottom was a journal, similar to Ruth's, filled with entries about Lila. Lila sat at one of the small student desks and read through years of Diana's thoughts. Entries about seeing Lila's high school graduation announcement in the local paper. About learning Lila had been accepted to college. About celebrating Lila's achievements from a distance, always hoping someday they'd be able to celebrate together. The final entry was dated 2 days before Diana's death. "My lawyer says we have enough evidence to challenge the adoption. After 23 years, I might finally get to meet my daughter. I might finally get to tell her how much I've loved her every single day we've been apart. I might finally get to hold her again. I'm terrified she won't want to know me. I'm terrified she'll hate me for not fighting harder, for not being strong enough to stop them from taking her. But I have to try. Even if she rejects me, even if she's angry, she deserves to know the truth. Tomorrow I meet with the lawyer to file the papers. Soon, everyone will know what the Henderson family did. And maybe, just maybe, Lila will understand that her mother never stopped fighting for her." Lila closed the journal and held it to her chest, crying for the mother she'd never known and the reunion that would never happen. Diana had died 2 days after writing that entry, on her way to expose the truth and meet her daughter. But Diana's fight hadn't been for nothing. Lila was finishing what her birth mother had started. She was exposing the Henderson family, seeking justice for Diana's murder, and claiming the life and identity that should have been hers all along. As Lila left the school with Diana's memory box, she felt both mothers with her. Diana's courage and relentless love. Ruth's flawed but genuine care and final act of redemption. Both women had shaped who Lila was, and both had given her different kinds of strength. Now it was time to use that strength to make sure the Henderson family paid for everything they'd done. The war wasn't over yet. But for the first time since this began, Lila knew she was going to win. The trial lasted 3 months. Paul and Miriam Henderson hired the most expensive lawyers money could buy, but the evidence was overwhelming. Ruth's recordings played in open court, Paul's voice admitting to Diana's murder echoing through the courtroom. The forged property deeds were examined by experts who confirmed they'd been created recently to frame Lila. Witness after witness testified about the campaign of intimidation and fraud. Lila sat through every day of testimony, watching the family that had terrorized her for 24 years finally face consequences. Paul's lawyers tried to discredit the recordings, claiming they'd been edited or taken out of context. They attacked Lila's character, painting her as a manipulative adopted daughter who'd stolen from the woman who'd raised her. But the jury saw through it. They saw what Lila had always been, a victim who'd found the courage to fight back. The verdicts came back on a Friday afternoon. Paul Henderson was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in Diana Morrison's death, fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison without possibility of parole. Miriam Henderson was found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and being an accessory to Diana's murder. She received 25 years. Cousins Jennifer and Brad were charged as accessories for their roles in the property fraud scheme. Jennifer received 5 years probation and community service. Brad got 18 months in minimum security for his more active participation. When the final gavel fell, Lila felt something release in her chest that she'd been carrying for 24 years. The people who'd made her feel small, who'd stolen her childhood, who'd murdered her birth mother, they were finally being held accountable. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Lila as she left with Walsh. "Miss Morrison, how do you feel about the verdicts?" "I feel like justice has finally been served. Not just for me, but for Diana Morrison, who died trying to expose the truth. This verdict says that powerful people can't buy their way out of consequences when they've committed terrible crimes." "What will you do now?" Lila smiled, and it felt genuine for the first time in months. "I'm going to honor both my mothers by building something good from everything they left me." 3 months after the trial ended, Lila stood in front of a newly renovated building in Riverside, the neighborhood where Diana had lived and worked. The sign above the door read Diana Morrison Education Center, serving foster and adopted children. The center had been Lila's first major project after regaining control of Morrison Holdings. She'd used part of Ruth's fortune to create a facility that provided tutoring, counseling, and support services specifically for children in foster care and adoptive situations. The mission was to ensure no other child felt the way Lila had, caught between worlds, never quite belonging anywhere. Janet from Riverside Elementary was there for the opening, along with dozens of Diana's former students and teaching colleagues. They'd all contributed memories and support to the center that honored Diana's legacy. "Diana would have loved this," Janet said, wiping tears from her eyes. "She spent her whole career helping kids who felt like outsiders. This center will continue that work in her name." Lila had also established the Ruth Henderson Redemption Scholarship, specifically for young people who'd experienced complicated family situations. The scholarship's motto was "Building Bridges from Broken Beginnings," and it provided full college funding for students who showed resilience and determination despite difficult circumstances. It felt right to honor Ruth this way, acknowledging both her crimes and her attempts to make amends. Ruth's reputation had been destroyed by the trial, but Lila wanted people to remember that humans were complicated, that someone could do terrible things and still genuinely love the person they'd hurt. Morrison Holdings had grown under Lila's management. She'd hired Patricia as full-time CEO and expanded their focus to include affordable housing development. They were building properties specifically designed for families transitioning out of foster care, providing stable housing at below-market rates. The business was thriving, generating enough profit to fund Lila's charitable projects while still growing the portfolio. She'd proven herself capable of everything the Henderson family had claimed she couldn't handle. 6 months after the trial, Lila visited Diana's grave for the first time since the press conference. She'd been too overwhelmed with legal proceedings and business decisions to come earlier, but now she needed to speak to her birth mother. The headstone was simple granite with Diana's name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Teacher and Mother." Lila had arranged for the mother part to be added after the trial, publicly claiming Diana as her parent. She sat on the grass beside the grave and pulled out a letter she'd written. "Dear Mom," she said aloud, reading what she'd written. "I call you Mom now because you earned that title more than anyone. You never stopped fighting for me, even when the system was designed to defeat you. You never stopped loving me, even though we were separated my entire life. And you died trying to bring me home." Her voice broke, but she continued. "I'm sorry I never knew you. I'm sorry we never got to have Sunday morning breakfasts or property visits or quiet conversations. I'm sorry you spent 23 years loving a daughter you couldn't hold." Lila wiped her eyes. "But I want you to know that your fight wasn't wasted. Everything you did, all the evidence you gathered, all the birthday cards you sent, it all mattered. It helped me understand who I really was and where I came from. And it gave me the courage to finish what you started." She placed fresh flowers on the grave. "The people who stole me from you are in prison now. The truth you died trying to expose is public knowledge. And I'm using the resources Ruth left me to help other kids who are caught in complicated situations like I was." Lila stood, preparing to leave, but then she noticed something. Someone had left a small toy on Diana's grave recently, a teddy bear with a note attached. "Miss Morrison was the best teacher I ever had. She made me feel like I mattered. Thank you for making sure people remember her." It was signed by one of Diana's former students. Lila realized she wasn't the only one who'd lost Diana. Hundreds of students, thousands of lives Diana had touched. They'd all lost something when she died. The Education Center would honor that legacy and ensure Diana's impact continued for generations. As Lila drove away from the cemetery, her phone rang. Walsh. Lila, I have news. The State Bar has opened an investigation into the lawyers who helped Paul and Miriam forge the property deeds. They're facing disbarment and potential criminal charges. Good. Everyone who participated should face consequences. There's more. Several of Diana's former students have started a foundation in her name. They want to partner with your education center to provide scholarships for kids interested in becoming teachers. They're calling it the Diana Morrison Legacy Fund. Lila felt tears starting again, but they were good tears this time. That's perfect. Diana wanted to be a teacher from the beginning. Having her legacy support future educators feels right. You've built something remarkable, Lila. Diana would be proud. Ruth would be proud. You should be proud. After hanging up, Lila drove to the cottage. It had been renovated now, transformed from deliberately shabby exterior to a beautiful home. She decided to keep it as her primary residence, the place where everything had changed. The basement filing cabinets were still there, but now they held happy documents. Business successes, thank you letters from scholarship recipients, photos from the education center opening. She'd replaced the evidence of crimes with evidence of healing. In the master bedroom, Lila had created a small memorial wall. Photos of Diana teaching her students. Photos of Ruth at the diner, serving coffee with that kind smile. And in the center, the hospital photo of Diana holding baby Lila, both of them looking at each other with pure love. Lila stood in front of the wall, looking at the two women who'd shaped her life in such different ways. Diana, who'd loved her purely but had been stolen from her. Ruth, who'd loved her guiltily but had tried to make amends. Both mothers had given her different gifts. Diana had given her the courage to fight for truth. Ruth had given her the resources to fight effectively. Together, they'd created someone strong enough to survive what had been done to her and powerful enough to change things for others. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Board meeting tomorrow at 9. We're reviewing the proposal for the new affordable housing development. Also, 3 more scholarship applications came in today. These kids' stories will break your heart in the best way. Lila smiled. This was her life now. Running a multi-million-dollar business, funding education and housing projects, helping kids who reminded her of herself. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she was working as a junior graphic designer, but it was the life she'd fought for and earned. She thought about Aunt Miriam's words at the will reading. At least Ruth tried to leave you something, even if it's not much. They'd had no idea. The cottage that seemed worthless was the key to everything. The adopted daughter they'd treated as charity was actually the rightful heir to an empire. The woman they'd tried to destroy had been stronger than any of them. Lila walked through the cottage one more time, remembering the day she'd first broken in through the basement window, desperate and frightened. That woman felt like a different person now. Lila had been transformed by truth, by justice, by finally understanding her worth. As the sun set through the cottage windows, Lila made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. She pulled out Diana's journal and Ruth's letters, reading through them again like she did sometimes when she needed to remember where she'd come from. Both women had fought for her in different ways. Both had loved her despite circumstances that made love complicated. And both had ultimately given her the most important gift, the truth about who she was and where she belonged. Lila Morrison belonged to herself now. Not to the Henderson family who'd stolen her. Not to the guilt and secrets that had defined her childhood. Not to anyone's definition of what she should be grateful for. She belonged to herself, and she was finally free. Her phone buzzed one more time. An email from a young woman named Keisha, one of the first scholarship recipients. Miss Morrison, I just wanted to let you know I got accepted to the teaching program at State University. I'm going to become an elementary school teacher, just like Miss Diana. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for proving that people like us can build something beautiful from broken beginnings. You changed my life. Lila read the email 3 times, feeling the weight of impact and responsibility and possibility. This was what Diana had died fighting for, A world where stolen children could find their way home, where truth mattered more than power, where love was stronger than law. And this was what Ruth had tried to build with her guilty fortune. A legacy that would outlast her crimes, resources that would help rather than harm, bridges built from broken trust. Lila Morrison was 25 years old, owner of a growing real estate empire, founder of an education center, and champion for kids who felt like they didn't belong. She was the daughter of two mothers who'd loved her in complicated ways. She was a fighter who'd refused to be destroyed by people who'd underestimated her. And she was just getting started. The Henderson family had thought they were teaching her a lesson about knowing her place. Instead, they'd created someone who would ensure no child ever had to fight the battles she'd fought alone. That night, Lila dreamed of Diana. They were sitting at a kitchen table eating pancakes that weren't burned, talking about everything they'd missed. In the dream, Diana said, "You did good, baby. You finished what I started. I'm so proud of you." When Lila woke up, she wasn't sure if it was just a dream or something more. But either way, she carried the feeling with her as she went to the Morrison Holdings board meeting, as she reviewed scholarship applications, as she continued building the legacy both her mothers had started. Some fortunes are measured in money. Some are measured in properties and portfolios. But Lila's greatest fortune was understanding finally that she'd never been charity, never been a burden, never been less than anyone who'd made her feel that way. She was Lila Morrison, Diana's daughter, Ruth's redemption, and the woman who'd proven that truth and justice could triumph even when the odds seemed impossible. The cottage Ruth had left her hadn't been ruins at all. It had been the foundation for everything she'd become. And from that foundation, Lila was building an empire of hope, justice, and second chances for everyone who'd ever been told they weren't enough.